Hey guys, I'm Daryl Hicks, CEO and founder of FlexPay, and I'm going to talk to you today about AI and why it's the right solution for solving churn. A little bit on my background. I actually started out in cybersecurity, self-taught coder, and I've got into subscriptions in a really big way, always running the operations and back office for them. I had a third-party administration business at one point, and we sold to or serviced tens of millions of customers across 4 continents, had a ton of data. I was always the optimization and efficiency geek, just looking at what we could do to maximize lifetime value, extend things out. And the learnings from all of that time, 20 years in the industry, led to creating FlexPay, which is the tool that we were using at first for internal use only to recover failed payments and extend lifetime value, and then decided to roll it into a standalone B2B SaaS. But I'm going to talk today about some of the challenges that we have around recovery and why AI is the right solution, how we ended up there. So we think that we understand the root causes of customer churn, right? It seems like it's pretty obvious exactly what's happening here. We know that our customers get dissatisfied at some point with the product. Customer fatigue means that maybe they're just deciding they don't want this anymore. We lose them sometimes to our competitors. Customer service issues. These are the things that we think about first and foremost as being the drivers of churn. And it's not wrong. This is absolutely the cause. However, what we really see in the industry is that there is not enough focus on the single largest cause of churn, which is really the involuntary churn. 48% of all of the churn for subscription companies in North America comes from involuntary churn. It's the largest cause. And yet, when you talk sometimes to subscription businesses and you ask them, what they're doing about their churn, they seem to be more focused on, we have to increase the product, we need more stickiness, we need more referrals and things like that to kind of offset the issue. What are we doing in customer service? And it's true, these are important things, but what are we doing about the biggest problem in managing our churn? The failed payments piece. Are we actively managing it? Or do we just say, it's the cost of doing business. This kind of thing is just going to automatically happen. It's, maybe it's the economy. Maybe we're slipping into a recession. There's numbers changing all over the place. Who knows why it's really happening? Well, this is the single biggest issue in managing churn and extending out lifetime value. So, key driver. What's interesting about this particular kind of churn, though, is that it's not just the fact that I've lost this customer, I've lost this transaction, I've lost this revenue. It actually it turns into voluntary churn. What we've seen in analyzing the data on this is that when customers end up with a failed payment, it has almost like an emotional impact on them. It's almost like if you've had that experience yourself where you've signed up to a subscription and then all of a sudden your payment fails for whatever reason. It's like, what do you mean I'm not credit worthy, right? And have a merchant actually push it back onto the customer and say, you need to do something to fix this, is absolutely a very poor strategy. It actually will end up turning into more churn long term. Yeah, go ahead.
When you introduce a voluntary loss on the same product or subscription or on another product you have?
It's a great question. It's actually across the board on that subscription for sure, but even on other ones as well. It really negatively impacts the brand experience for the customer in dealing with that particular merchant. So it has a cascading effect. So it's actually not just that we've lost that transaction, now we've lost this customer, it's cascading across other products and services. It becomes like kind of a death spiral on the way down. So extremely important that we make sure that we understand how we're going to solve this problem. What is the strategy that we're going to use for it? And any time that this churn, that this failed payment is visible to the customer, it's going to create issues for us in the future. Whatever we can do to solve the problem behind the scenes in the payment rails, it's going to be a much better experience for everyone. So this is, if you're going to solve any problem in your business, it's usually really important to start with, why is it even happening? What we often see happening is, someone says, okay, I have a lot of churn in my business. I'm going to send some text messages, send some emails. I'm going to rely on customer service to call people. I'm going to retry the soft declines a few times, and that's going to help to solve my problems. It's not a bad strategy. It kind of makes sense on the surface. But the sequence, the order in which you tackle that is going to be extremely important. But also, in order to maximize your recovery, you have to understand why the payments are failing in the first place. And unfortunately, this information is not readily available. We were having conversations even earlier today about, running your own American Express card through an American Express merchant account and calling up American Express and asking them, why did it decline on this merchant account and not decline on this other merchant account? And they'll be like, well, we can't share that information with you. It's private. Well, wait a minute. I'm the cardholder and I'm the merchant. You have to share. No, sorry. Proprietary, private information. This is the issue that we're running into in the payment rails, is that we end up with, a lot of cases, the stakeholders in the ecosystem acting in a very self-interested manner. These closed box silos, very black box, not saying what it is that they want to do. And this is actually driving the problem, exacerbating the issue. So we want to make sure that if we're going to maximize our recovery, that we really understand at a deep level why it's happening. We want to make sure that our customers, as much as possible, aren't even aware of the fact that a payment failed in the first place. This is critical, making sure that the visibility to the issue is as low as possible, which is going to help us to create more churn. If we create visibility to it, it's actually going to make the churn problem even worse, is what the data is showing. Which then takes us to, well, why AI? How does AI fit into all of this? Well, again, if you understand why the problem is actually happening in the first place, you can start to understand why AI and machine learning is a good solution and why it's actually happening. If you were at my session yesterday, we talked a lot about some of the constraints and the pressures that the issuers are under. We've had a lot of conversations with heads of risk, of credit unions and financial institutions and issuers, and they're trying to manage their own losses, their own fraud losses on their side. $30 billion a year in fraud losses to the issuers. That's on their P&L, that's on their balance sheet. And the only way that they can really manage and mitigate those fraud losses is to try to suss out where the fraud is and decline more transactions. And unfortunately, there's just not enough data in the existing payment rails today for them to really make the right decisions. Also, running on antiquated legacy technology doesn't help in a lot of cases. But ultimately, the fact that it kind of happens in a black box and they get to make their own decisions with very little transparency and very little accountability isn't really helping either. Whereas when we can leverage machine learning, this becomes extremely powerful because, well, another reason why AI is important maybe to say is that there's 8,000 issuers in America and each one of them is making their own decision independent of one another on what transactions they're going to approve and decline. So there's not one single source of being able to go and manage it. So if you have 8,000 issuers with billions of transactions flowing through, each making their own decisions, and those decisions change over time, we can start to see why actually this is a problem that's ready-made for AI and machine learning. Because if we have a rules-based system, it might capture a good chunk of the problem. But if we want to get deeper down into the niches of each individual transaction, we're going to need something like machine learning and AI to be able to manage that level of data and the complexity. So rules-based systems following a preset decision tree approach are not adequate to really go deep enough. As the cliche goes, the riches are in the niches. If we want to get deep down into there and really optimize this properly, we need an individualized approach on each transaction. So strategies that we see working really well, most subscription merchants, if they have a rules-based approach like we did before we were using AI, it's like, well, we're going to retry all our NSFs and do not honors on Fridays and Saturdays in the afternoon. We're going to use account updater. We're going to stay away from the hard declines. We're going to, retry them on the 1st and the 15th because maybe that's closer to when people are getting their paychecks. There's a few things that we can do. And guess what? Those strategies actually work really well. Why do they work so well? Yes, go ahead.
So you're saying to do this using a hard con?
No.
Okay.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. Well, actually, so what's interesting is that we actually recover some hard declines. Not all hard declines are actually hard declines, which again is another reason why using machine learning to properly analyze the transactions can help you to understand that. We actually, for some merchants, we get as much as 11% recovery on the total pool of hard declines without creating chargebacks.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I thought this was the soft decline space, but this is the hard decline.
No, and we've even seen this, how we kind of stumbled into this is back in 2012, we had a a problem in one of the systems. One of our merchants had a problem in their system, and they started retrying all their declines. And we noticed that some of the hard declines actually got approved the next day, and they didn't turn into chargebacks. We're like, what in the world just happened there? Yes?
Can I just ask everybody, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand so I can have a mic so it can...
Oh, yeah, that's right, for the people that are tied in on Zoom. Yes, exactly. Thanks. Appreciate that. The idea here is that there's so many different factors coming into play on why a transaction might be declined. There's literally hundreds of different reasons that could be affecting it, that we really need to look at all the different variables of that individual transaction in order to best understand, should we even try to recover that transaction? And if so, what is the best strategy for it? In fact, we train all of our machine learning models as well on chargeback data and refund data. And we'll see sometimes in some of the machine learning models will say, yes, there's a high likelihood of recoverability for this transaction, but there's also a high likelihood of future refund and chargeback, which means don't even try, don't even bother. So we can optimize for this. Again, the power of having AI to study these transactions that way. So, however, just because we say, okay, I've got a ton of data, I'm going to throw some AI at it, that means that everything's going to work swimmingly, right? Well, no, unfortunately, that's not the way that it is. There's a few challenges in data. I love this quote that comes from one of the leading AI people at Amazon. Toy data sets generate toy results, right? The quality of the data that we're getting is extremely important. How much data we have? Giga data sets, right? That means billions of transaction records that are required in order to, because AI is nothing more ultimately than pattern matching. Really sophisticated algorithmic pattern matching, but it's going through and it's looking for the patterns and identifying what's working and what's not. And so we need a ton of data, and we need high quality data. So, and I love this quote too, your machine learning model is only as good as the data it's trained on, and data is often cited as the #1 challenge to adopting machine learning. First version of our machine learning was trained on, like I mentioned, just over 1 billion transaction records that only came from the acquiring side. Then we started to layer in data from the fraud systems on the merchant side and get a meaningful lift. And then we were able to bring in data from the issuing side. What's interesting is it's the juxtaposition of those 3 different data sources and the way that you combine them in together and the quantity of data that you get from it that actually started to generate the most lift and the most benefits in being able to really understand what's going on in the payment rails, why this is happening, and to be able to get the best performance on fixing it. Another issue is that, you get the data scientists and the engineers kind of working in their own dark silo without talking to the business people, and we can end up with really, really bad outcomes. AI is a very powerful tool. It's like, put a chainsaw in someone's hands. If they know exactly what they're doing and how they want to use it, they can do really amazing things with it, but it is just a tool. The way that we apply it, the way that we train the data, the type of data that we train it on is extremely important. So bringing in the business stakeholders and having the conversations. This is why we've been spending a lot of time talking to the issuers, talking to the heads of risk of the issuers, and talking to the software vendors and the issuing processors. Why are we spending all that time doing that? Because these are the key stakeholders in the ecosystem along with the merchants and the acquirers and the networks to make sure that we're getting the right outcome on this. So bringing in the business people to say, look, if we're going to use AI, let's point it in this direction. These are the lead variables that we really need to be focused on and optimizing around in order to get the right outcomes that we need. Yes, domain expertise and how we apply the AI. That's what we've been talking about. So we often see this, right? There was an interesting case that we had with a merchant recently who said, well, we have a really good rules-based system that we've been running over here to recover our transactions, and we tested it against an AI solution, and the rules-based solution performed significantly better than the AI solution. Well, that's not necessarily surprising to me whatsoever, because again, just because we say, I'm going to take AI and machine learning and apply it to this problem doesn't guarantee in and of itself that it's going to be successful, because it is, again, just a tool. It's how you wield that tool and the type of data that you're training it on that's really critical. So the flow kind of looks like this. How are we going to solve for this problem? How are we going to maximize recovery? We talked about that earlier. What's the sequencing in order to maximize the recovery that we get? It needs to look like this. So obviously if it's approved, we know we don't need to do anything with this. It's good, we're all in the money. However, if it's declined, the very first thing that we should be doing is our invisible recovery. Invisible recovery. And obviously what we're advocating for here is an AI-driven invisible recovery solution. But even for merchants who only have, a legacy system that's running on rules, If you are using multiple strategies to mitigate against your churn, make sure that whatever you're doing first is the stuff that doesn't involve any interaction with your customer whatsoever. We've seen over and over and over again that even if you have a great customer who loves the product, as soon as you're engaging with them and asking them to get involved in doing something, you're creating an opportunity for churn. It's a negative brand experience for them. Overall, it's going to be to the detriment of the merchant. And then after that, well, that's when we can start to bring in other solutions after the invisible recovery. So another thing that's really interesting that's starting to emerge is we might think, okay, so I got AI for my invisible recovery, and then I'm going to send my text messages, send my emails, and use my customer service. Believe it or not, AI is now available in several tools out there to help to optimize the customer service components, the texting components, the email components. In fact, one of the largest telcos here in the US has rolled out a new strategy where they're using AI. They brought in behavioral scientists, psychologists, and they custom tailored all of the, they created different avatars basically for their customer demographics. And then they're using AI to custom tailor the content and the cadence of texting and emailing. Is the right solution for this customer going to be a text message? Is it going to be an email? Is it going to be customer service? What should we say? What should we not say? What's the best time to reach them? How do we want to best engage? What was interesting is when they rolled this out on a test cohort of their customers, they saw a 70% reduction in inbound calls to customer service around failed payment issues. People were self-curing with this strategy. And they'd been using text messages and emails before, but when they started using AI to tailor the approach, even on the digital engagement, they saw a massive, meaningful improvement. So again, AI in the invisible recovery component, and then using AI even on the digital outreach and customer service. And if you want to know more about some of the tools that are out there, you can come find me afterwards and I can talk to you about some of our favorites and who we see being used. In fact, we're actually doing a new tech mix with one of them right now, which I'm pretty excited about. So this is what we need to break it down to. If we are a merchant and we are having this issue, the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, well, what is my current failed payment rate? And I love, like, even in the session that Jay was doing on Bold, where he was saying, you know, here's this KPI that's so important in your business. How many customers am I getting through referrals? And so few people know what that number is. They might say, yeah, I know it's important, but have you actually taken the time to quantify it and really look at it? It's like that Peter Drucker 101, right? Like what gets measured gets managed. So you might say, yeah, okay, I know I've got a churn problem and I probably have a bunch of failed payments inside of that churn that's driving it, but we really need to quantify it. Look closely, get in, really measure it, break it down by all the different decline codes and reason codes. Then we have to think about, okay, now that we've quantified the problem, what are we going to do about it? What are the different strategies that are available? And as we said earlier, the sequencing is extremely important, right? How much recovery do we earn from these strategies right now? What's our baseline, in other words? And then what's our tech strategy to optimize the recovery? This is when we're talking about the sequencing, making sure we're doing the invisible recovery first and all the people-powered and digital engagement stuff afterwards. So that's basically it. This is the last slide. I still get excited and frustrated at the same time. When I talk to some merchants, I was on the phone with a friend of mine, a fellow YPOer who called me up and said, you know, I've got this churn problem. I know, like, you're the churn guy. I got to talk to you. And, you know, I know I've got a real problem in the product and there's something about the placement and the referral partners aren't pitching it properly. Like, you know, brainstorm with me. And I asked him that question, like, well, what's your failed payment rate on your renewals, on your monthly renewals? And he's like, I don't really think I have a problem with that. My CFO would have already told me if that was where my problem was coming from. And I'm like, wow. So we talked for 20, 30 minutes. And at the end of it, I just said, look, just do me a favor and go talk to your CFO and pull the reports out of your payment processing and really take a look. And the next day, he sends me an email. He's like, oh my God, 18% of my fresh transactions are declining every time we process. Who knew? He's like, this is actually 70% of my whole problem. And here I've got everyone in customer service and doing all these different things. Yeah, that's the real hidden, the bottom part of the iceberg that's really driving it. So recognize that the problem exists and there actually can be something to be done about it. Quantify the rates and the financial costs. Then you can start to craft a strategy. Upgrade your payments tech stack with PAM, that's Payment Authorization Management. It's a new emerging scene that's really exciting. If you haven't heard about it, you can do some research online, Google it, and you'll discover some really interesting technologies that are falling into Payment Authorization Management. And then, of course, from there, we need to iterate, right? We're going to deploy a solution. We're going to monitor its performance. We're going to improve it over time. And then we start to get these exponential returns. Instead of falling into the death spiral, flowing down from like getting these things wrong, we actually get a virtuous cycle of looping things up. So that's it. Any questions?
All right, well, I'll start off. You mentioned the somebody who had a rules-based approach and they implemented AI and it actually didn't go so well. Mm-hmm. What's the other side of that? Generally speaking, when you implement an AI solution, what's the lift that you would expect?
It's great. So we had a really great rules-based solution that we had built for internal use in 2012. On average, it was recovering about 34% of all the failed payments for the customers that we were servicing in our third-party administration business. When we switched to the first version of our AI models in 2016, that exact same merchant went up to 46% recovery. And since then, as the models refined, I think we're now on version 23 of our AI models. They're now, for that same merchant, recovering in the high 50s% of the total transaction. So it can be quite meaningful. I think the average lift that merchants are seeing when they switch from rules-based to a good quality AI solution is about an 80% increase in recovery, which means if they were at a 20%, they're going to end up at 36, or if they were at like 40%, they're going to end up at, what is that, the math real quick, 70 some odd percent recovery on it. And we actually do see some merchants who are literally recovering 73, 74% of all their failed payments when they use a good AI solution. So it's quite meaningful. Any other questions? I don't know enough about AI to really go deep into the super technical, geeky stuff. I just know enough to be dangerous. But yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for that information. I'm curious about when it comes to AI and some of the solutions you guys are deploying, how much of that can you also apply at the initial point of sale? So not that recurring transaction, but we see a lot of our declines actually at that initial conversion enrollment point. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the $1 million question that we're working on. So the right solution to this problem is to be able to bring both sides of the equation together. That's the merchants, the cardholder and the merchants, and the issuers, and everyone in between. But really, like, the issuers are always going to know more about a given customer and their risk profile than anyone else, but the merchant's always going to know more about the risk profile of a transaction than anyone else. Like the device that's being used and the IP address and the contents of the shopping cart. If we really want to better understand fraud, we need to bring both sides together, which is the project that I'm really excited about that we're working on, which will then do exactly what you're talking about, help us to actually affect in a really meaningful way the approval rate even on the first transactions. So there's a few things that we do right now today to help on upfront approval rates. In fact, we have several merchants right here in the city actually who are pretty large direct response marketers, and what they've done is they've created a gap where Best Buy also does this, right? When you sign up and buy something on Best Buy and they say, thank you, your order is being processed, they never actually charge the card right away. They do inventory control, they do fraud control, things like that, and then they only try the card a few hours later. Now it's moved from a customer-initiated transaction to a merchant-initiated transaction, and if it fails, they can leverage some of the solutions that we're talking about to fix it. So, and we have plenty of merchants actually who are doing that right now, where they've created that little bit of a gap, where they have some internal processes, and then they can leverage solutions like this for the merchant-initiated. For the real-time customer-initiated, there are some things that we're doing right now, some least cost routing, cleaning up data fields and mitigating it, but the real holy grail is going to be creating that better authorization loop directly with the issuers, which is the not so top secret project that we're working on right now. But yeah, there are definitely some things that we can do to help even on the upfront stuff, for sure. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So with AI, at what point do you also have to factor in the number of retries before it actually, you've hit your 4 limit and it's gone and you stop trying again?
That's a great tee up. Thank you very much. Yeah, we absolutely live in a world where we have a finite number of attempts that we can send transactions, which means you have to make sure that you're going with your best strategy first, right? We have some merchants who say, well, I'm going to pick up the low-hanging fruit and just like have my rules-based system do the first couple of attempts, and then I'll have an AI solution come in afterwards. And that overall reduces the overall recovery of the transaction pool. In a world where you can only retry a certain number of times, you want to make sure that you're using the AI, and that's absolutely something that we manage for, right? In fact, it's not just on a merchant account level, it's even on an issuer level, on a cardholder level. There's going to be plenty of transactions that the AI models will say, you only have 2 attempts on this one, right? So you better make sure, in the AI models, one of the things that we did is we said, what is the percentage of likelihood that this is going to be the right strategy? And if it's anything below like a 93%, for example, we're probably not going to process it. Now, that doesn't mean it has a 93% success rate. It just means we have a 93% certainty that this is the right strategy for that transaction. And if we have, like, say, limits that are being imposed on the merchant account, maybe there was a fraud problem or something like that, all we do at that point is say, now the minimum threshold is now 96%. Or for these particular customers, this particular issuer, we want to make sure the certainty is a 96 or a 97%. And then what that does is it overall lowers the retry pool without sacrificing too much of the recovery. Because one thing's absolutely for sure, declines beget declines. We've seen some merchants, believe it or not, that were literally just taking all of their declines and retrying them every day for 60 days. And you would not believe the impact that caused on their fresh attempts moving future. It just started to fall off the cliff because the reputation of their merchant account with the issuers was being severely impacted. So we cannot, even if Visa allowed us to go more than 4, we would never, we don't benefit from doing that. Hammering declines is just going to cause more problems. Yeah.
So one of the things you talked about in order for this to be effective is having really large data sets, like in terabytes. Mm-hmm. When you're working with smaller or medium-sized merchants, have you found it effective to try to like bootstrap the data set to make it larger or to supplement it with other similar merchants, or what is your strategy for that?
Yeah, it's great. So the encouraging thing is that once we've got good data on an issuer, the learnings from the larger data pool, about 70 to 80% of the time, they will correlate to all the merchants that want to connect into that. There will be lift and gain, though. As we process more transactions on a given merchant, we can start to get even more lift and more learnings, better performance over time. And yes, we absolutely do what you're talking about, like these ensemble models where we say, okay, here is a whole bunch of merchants that are in the same MCC or that are acquiring all their customers through the same kind of channels. They do like, decent lookalike models, and then we can build AI models off of that, and that gets us even more performance. But yeah, even for small merchants, it works just fine.
Yes, I wanted to piggyback on that and ask if there's a floor. Like I work with some of my clients are very small companies. They don't do a lot of transactions. What's like a minimum number of transactions that it would be worthwhile to try something like this?
So even on really small merchants, this works phenomenally, right? 70 to 80% of the learnings from the total pool are going to correlate perfectly to even a super tiny merchant. Just the reality is that at the end of the day, percentages don't pay bills, dollars and cents do. So if you say to a merchant, I'm going to recover 56% of all of your failed payments, and they only have $1,000 a month in failed payments, it's probably not going to move the needle for them. They're probably just going to go with a good enough rules-based solution, one and done. They've got bigger problems to solve in their business, right? Product market fit, hiring a team, scaling things up. But absolutely the opposite is also true. Like, some of our merchants who are on our platform are running $20 to $30 million a month in failed payments. Well, at that point, you need to make sure you are really using the best strategy, because every single 0.1% of lift is going to just generate so many dollars, right? So the tech works great, even for small merchants. What we've just found is, unfortunately, the motivation sometimes isn't there because the dollars and cents just don't add up enough. There is still a tech integration to be done, right? So you have to pull out some dev resources and things like that. Yeah, it's good. I like that, though. It's a good question. Awesome. All right, well, if there's anything else, you guys know where to find me. My contact info isn't up on there, but whatever. You can find me pretty easily. It's Daryl@flexpay.io, and you find me on LinkedIn and all that kind of good stuff, and happy to geek out even more on this. Thanks, guys.